ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
There's all this talk about artificial intelligence and health, everything. I mean, you go into a Google search now, you get an AI summary there, which I try not to read because I'm not sure if I believe it, and then go into something else. But they're talking about AI in meds. Are you using it in the surgery?
I'm not yet. I know colleagues are. There are some colleagues in other clinics who are using it.
What do they use it for? Is this for
note-taking?
Oh, right.
They say it saves them time and it helps them consider diagnoses they may not have.
I mean, so note-taking. I mean, it's listening to the conversation.
It's listening. This is where I start to get reluctant, honestly. Yeah. It makes me nervous because I do read my indemnity, my medico-legal news quite heavily, and it's...
And if you rely on AI, you might be stuffed.
Yes, you have to check the notes. I don't think it saves me that much time. I'm quite a quick typer. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm pretty quick. It also helps me when I'm typing get to a diagnosis.
That's
and
when
I think about things,
yeah.
Yes. And I can't guarantee I don't feel patient confidentiality. If AI is listening, what's it doing with the data?
That's what I wonder about. Anyway, we're going to be talking on today's Health Report about another use of AI, which is disturbing to some. Would you let artificial intelligence make some decisions for you at the end of your life?
Very interesting stuff. That's coming up on the Health Report. I'm Priya Alexander on Gadigal Land.
And I'm Norman Swan, also on Gadigal Land.
Also on the show, we've been hearing about outbreaks of measles, doom and gloom about our immunisation rates, but is it really all as bad as we think? Some surprises for you in a moment.
We're getting much better at treating and, in fact, curing some cancers, but that means that more people are grappling with the long-term effects of treatment. There's an app that's been developed for one particular cancer, but it could apply to others and it could change things.
And as we've mentioned, artificial intelligence is everywhere. Some doctors think it might help people make decisions for their loved ones at their end of life.
Well, let's get into some news.
Let's get into some news. Now, it's a tricky time in the world.
Well, you noticed.
I have. I'm not living under a rock, Norman, believe it or not.
Consulting room from time to time and look around.
I do have a life. Oh, my goodness.
What's happening? Oh, God. Yeah.
There's a lot happening. In the US, for instance, the Trump White House has come out and suggested that the pandemic was due to a lab leak.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary website. We'll put it in our show notes about the promotion of this as a lab leak. It's not new for Trump or indeed his supporters. They've been viciously against Tony Fauci, and they've alleged it comes from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And now there's this website which lists their arguments that this was a leak from the lab.
And it's quite an interesting website. You sent it to me, and my husband, who's also a doctor, we thought it was not a real website.
No, you've got to double check.
And it is, and it's very interesting because there are some truths in there, but then there's a lot of interesting stuff without much evidence.
The high level point to be made here is no one knows. And China hasn't helped, because they've clamped down on information, they've stopped scientists telling other scientists overseas what's going on. The lab leak is a possible reason that it happened. Many people think that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is just next door to the seafood and fresh live market. It's actually about 11 kilometres away, so it's quite a distance away. It's not next door. And they were researching coronaviruses. And there has been some debate about whether their biosecurity, in other words, containing infectious diseases or infections or bugs in their laboratory, was as good as it could be. There have been some concerns about that, although that's debatable. So the lab leak hypothesis is possible. The paranoia about that is added to because of allegations of them genetically manipulating coronaviruses to amp them up to see what it would take to make them into pandemic viruses. American scientists who are working with the Wuhan scientists say they weren't true gain-of-function studies, but there was genetic manipulation, so there was a bit of risk there. But they tend to know, scientists overseas kind of know what Wuhan was working on, and they know the genome. But it's possible that it was a lab. It's
possible.
And there have been lab leaks of other infectious diseases in the past. But most pandemics have started from animals. But the bulk of the evidence is that it did get into that market. It was in a very confined space in that market. They've swabbed the cages. And the part of the market that was affected is also where cases seem to emerge from and spread out to the rest of Wuhan. In other words, from that end, I think it was the northeast end from memory, in the marketplace.
Into humans.
Into humans. Humans in the market. There is evidence to point to it coming from that market. Now, other people say, well, it could still have come from a lab leak and it gets into the market. True, absolutely true. And we will probably never know.
What's concerning, though, is the way the information is presented on the White House website is that there's robust evidence to support the claim that it's from a lab leak. But we're both saying, we don't know. We may never know.
And even people who, like David Baltimore, Nobel laureate, David Relman, who's an eminent infectious disease specialist at Stanford, or he was at Stanford, give some credence to the lab leak hypothesis. But they all say it's a possibility, that it's not definite. We should just treat it seriously. This is treated as fact. And what you should read that as is as a political document and an ideological document rather than a scientific document.
It's certainly an interesting read. Last week we spoke about measles, what's happening in the US, how it impacts us here in Australia, and we learned that we're below that magic number of 95% for herd immunity.
Yeah, and we got an email during the week.
We did.
From somebody who actually knows what he's talking about, as opposed to, me, you know what you're talking about, but as opposed
Hopefully.
to me. Professor Peter McIntyre is Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Otago and used to be Director of the National Centre for Immunisation Research. Welcome back to the Health Report, Peter.
Nice to speak to you.
You sent a couple of papers, and I'm looking at one of them now, which I actually found gobsmacking. So it's a graph, just to describe it for listeners, it's a graph. And these are measles cases, or measles incidents, across the years. Red is United States, yellow is Canada, blue is Australia, green is New Zealand. And you can barely see the red on the graph, meaning we're thinking America's this disaster zone, but America's had almost no measles for years. And yet you look at Canada's pretty high, Australia's not as high as Canada, but it's up there, and New Zealand's off the chart. What's going on?
It's always good to have context. And even though we've heard a lot about what's happening in Texas in particular of recent times, the US has actually punched well above its weight in terms of measles control, like going back 25 years. And this is pretty remarkable given how large and diverse the US is. So that there are many years when there were actually fewer cases of measles in the US than there were in Australia. And the US has a population that's, maybe 20 times or so that of Australia. So it's something that a lot of people don't think about. And I was struck by it when I first became aware of it.
So what are they doing that we are not, particularly that Canada, Australia, New Zealand are not?
Well, I think Australia and the US are doing different versions of the same thing, in the sense that the US has, for a long time, had very tight policies about having your vaccination status, including your, obviously, measles vaccination status, checked, not just when you start school, but if you talk to people who've spent any amount of time in the US with their kids, if they change schools, you have to provide the documents all over again. And in fact, if you look at California, which had a big scare in 2014, they introduced the most restrictive provisions anywhere in the world. You literally can't start school in California if you haven't had your vaccines. And so parents of children who haven't had their vaccines are forced to homeschool. And if you look at California, even in the most recent data, it's still up there at 97%. And I think that in many ways is the secret sauce for the US, because what happened back in New South Wales in 2012 was that there were all these children who were of high school age or older primary who had slipped through the net or arrived in Australia later and no one knew about them. That doesn't seem to happen in the US. And in fact, if you look at the map now, Ontario has something like 880 cases. Right next door in places like Ohio, New York State, Michigan, etc., there's hardly any cases in the US. And in fact, Ontario has more cases than Texas does. And we don't really hear about that.
Peter, do we think the no jab, no pay policy in Australia has helped things? Because if you look at the measles, mumps, rubella coverage rate in the US, it's in, the 95% realm, and we're much lower than that. So is that policy effective?
Well, it's actually something, Priya, that I think people lose track a little bit of in terms of looking just at MMR coverage in Australia, not looking at full immunisation. And there has been some justified comment that the full immunisation number has gone down in Australia over the last couple of years. But if you look at what happens with measles, mumps, rubella, actually the most recent data from NCRS in 2024 shows that it actually is above 95% when you look at what happens by the time you're 5. If you wait until the age of 5, you find that it goes up from that 92% figure at 2 years of age. By the time you get to 5, kids have slowly caught up. And so the most recent data is, 96.3 for 2 doses. And in fact, if you look at Aboriginal kids, it's 98.3, which is fantastic. The coverage in Aboriginal children is actually higher than in the rest of the population. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be alert and closely following our measles status, but we're in pretty good shape. If you look at what happens by the time you get to 5, with no jab, no pay, no jab, no play, all those things having been in place for over 10 years, we've actually been above 95%. If you wait until 5 rather than looking at 2, we've been there for some time. And I suppose one of the things we will have to keep a little bit of an eye on, as it's likely that measles, we're not going to achieve eradication of measles like we have with smallpox and have no measles. We're going to have measles in plenty of other places. So little islands like Australia that have achieved elimination of homegrown measles, if we continue to have that situation in another 10 years, 15 years, we could have waning of immunity in our young adults.
This is an issue of whether you're going to need an adult booster.
Yeah, if you haven't had any measles in your country and you're relying on your vaccine-acquired immunity, then in order to be fully protected against measles coming from outside, we may need to look at more doses. And that's something that is going to need attention in places like Australia who've been able to keep that going as we move forward.
Just on another matter, RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Secretary of Health and Human Services in the United States, has proposed changing the COVID rules for children for vaccination, leaving it to the doctor and the family. What's your view on that? Because it looks at the first blush to be pretty much like what we do already here.
Yes, well, of course, the US is an interesting example of the only country which actually has COVID vaccines recommended for children under 5, in fact, from 6 months of age, identical to their flu recommendations. It's the only country that does that. So nowhere in Europe, not Canada, not Australia, not New Zealand, nowhere else does it. And despite the fact that they've been recommending this for some time, I mean, their coverage in young children is woeful. It's less than 10%. So I think this could be an example of where what our RFK's saying is not quite as off beam as a lot of the other stuff, some of the nonsense he's talked about measles. It probably is realistic for the US to say, look, we now know that children in that age group are really well protected against COVID. They do a fantastic job of meeting new viruses. We don't need to be concerned unless they've got severe other health problems. And we're not winning anyway. We've had this recommendation and no one's doing it. So we should concentrate on things like flu, where we've got a long track record. And in fact, the US has been banging away at flu for a long time, and they've got good high coverage in their children, better than Australia at this point in time.
So focus on what counts.
Absolutely.
Always illuminating, Peter. Thanks for joining us on the Health Report.
Thanks, Norman.
That's Professor Peter McIntyre, Professor of Paediatrics at the University of Otago in New Zealand.
On Radio National, you're with the Health Report. Coming up later in the show, would you trust artificial intelligence to make a life or death decision for you? I don't know. I don't think so.
Well, Shelby Traynor, our producer, has made this feature and it gets quite convincing.
Okay.
So wait and see.
You've got some information about support people can access if they've had cancer and been cured.
Yeah, one of the problems of cancer treatment is that the treatment can cause side effects.
Yes.
One of the worst side effects of cancer treatment is later onset cancer. You can get a different cancer because of the genetic effects, if you like, of the treatment itself. But people can end up with disabilities from it. But what's remarkable is actually how little is known about the long-term effects of what's called survivorship. So you've got a cancer, you've survived for a long time, and you're not quite well after a period of time. I'm not saying this happens to everybody. We actually don't know the percentage of people it happens to. How much of that is the cancer or how much of that is just something else that's going on? To solve that problem and really to get a proof of concept, a group of people at Concord Hospital have looked at a cancer which is curable, which is Hodgkin's disease, and started an app which registers people with Hodgkin's disease, and they note their issues and problems over a period of time. So here to explain it is Dr. Nicole Wong-Du, a haematologist at Concord Hospital, and Lara Melly, who's a Hodgkin survivor and a patient investigator for the My Hodgkin, My Health app.
Hodgkin lymphoma is a type of blood cancer, a cancer of the lymph nodes. Relatively uncommon cancer, although about 800 Australians are diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma each year.
And many are cured, so that number accumulates through the years.
It does. And around 85% of people won't have the Hodgkin lymphoma return. But the pathway to cure involves chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and that can lead to some long-term side effects.
What's your story, Lara, in terms of your experience of Hodgkin's?
I was 25 years old when I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's. I had a little lump on my collarbone. Went to my GP and she was suspicious that it was Hodgkin lymphoma. And within 3 weeks of meeting her, we were into treatment.
And you've been going well since?
Yes, so that was 10 years ago. I had a couple of different types of chemotherapy because mine didn't work the first time. I had some complications along the way because I like to keep the haematologists on their toes.
Excellent. You're to be commended for that.
So we like to stay at the forefront of medicine, and I had some liver failure along the way, so we had to change my chemotherapy. But lucky enough, they were able to develop a new treatment plan for me and complete my chemotherapy as well as then do the radiotherapy required to get me cured.
So, Nicole, the idea here is that whilst you're cured, you're not necessarily free of symptoms for the rest of your life. I mean, there are issues that can arise. And it's almost a proof of concept, this My Hodgkin's app, because you want to see whether this is a way of actually monitoring survivors with other bloodborne cancers.
Absolutely. Lymphoma in general is quite common and, affects half as many people as lung cancer and a third as many as breast cancer. So we absolutely would like to move on to the more common types of lymphoma with this app.
And what do you want to know?
We want to know how patients are doing in their long-term survivorship, which is what we call your life after treatment. And when we say long-term, we want to know how people are doing 10, 20 and even 30 years later. By that time, they've become separated from their original haematologist, which is a great thing, but they still have a higher incidence of heart disease and also of second cancers that are a result of their chemotherapy and radiation.
So are you planning that this feedback that you might get from people will loop back to the treatment, and you might say, well, if we were to change treatment X, a lower dose or a different treatment, we might get a different result? Is that what this is
about? We would hope that it has that direct outcome, help to then change the next generation of treatments. I've talked about chemotherapy and radiotherapy, but the way we're going to keep curing patients with Hodgkin lymphoma is with immunotherapy.
These are these relatively new drugs which unleash the immune system onto the cancer.
Exactly, and they appear to have a lot lower incidence of toxicities. That may well be the case in long term as well. We would like to make sure we can follow that up.
So Lara, you've become a researcher.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been providing my data through the app and the conversations that can come from that as well to help the team change their strategies and to tailor those treatment plans for cancer patients.
And have you had some long-term effects?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. They gave me 2 weeks at the time of diagnosis to do an accelerated IVF cycle and save some eggs. And as my liver failure continued throughout my chemotherapy treatment, we did have to change and go to a more harsh type of chemotherapy.
So you were glad you preserved some eggs?
I couldn't be more grateful because after 3 years of IVF just recently, we now have my beautiful baby daughter, Charlotte.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you, who's 6 months now. So it wouldn't have been possible without the information that the team used from previous patients.
So Nicole, whilst this is commendable, having this app that people can get involved with and that it might be a proof of concept for other forms of cancer, it's not comprehensive. In other words, not everybody is logging on, and people who actually go into the app might be different from the people outside and may not be getting a representative sample.
Absolutely. The same can be said about any form of research. Traditional research is located in hospitals, as you know, so there's already a bias of who participates in traditional research. And we will also have a bias of people who participate in our research. They might start out as being the more interested patients, but what we'd like to do is really reach as many people as possible. And in particular, we want to get places where traditional research struggles to reach, people in regional centres and hopefully, when we have an international phase, people in diverse countries where they don't necessarily have an economic platform to support high-level research, and we want to know about survivorship in a really diverse population.
I mean, the one difference here is there's no doctor mediating this, taking down notes or a nurse taking down notes. This is direct from the horse's mouth in a sense. The person with the cancer who's survived is telling it directly with no filtering.
Absolutely. It's patient centralised. It is straight from my experience direct to the doctors so that they can use this data to tailor their plans.
Absolutely. We believe that patients know what's happening and what has happened to them in their health, and they are the best source. And we've asked not just Lara but other patients, why are they taking part? And many are doing it from a purely altruistic point of view. They want to help. They want the patient that's coming behind them to have access to better care in the future. But also, just by taking part in the questionnaire, it's giving them an idea of the possible side effects, and it's actually giving them a bit of education about what to look out for. And when they finish their survey, patients are presented with a summary of all the information that they've put in. They can actually take that to their GP and they can say, look, I've been asked about whether I've had any issues with my heart, and it may prompt some patients to have a conversation about cardiac symptoms earlier than they might have. So we really feel like we are empowering patients by putting more information in their hands.
Thank you very much to you both for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Nicole Wong-Du, a haematologist at Concord Hospital, and Lara Melly, who's a Hodgkin survivor and patient investigator for the My Hodgkin, My Health app. And I should just say, Priya, her little baby was there. This baby where she preserved her eggs, and now she's got this wonderful little baby.
And you met the child?
I met the child who was outside in the corridor outside the studio. That was lovely.
Wonderful.
We'll put the link to the My Hodgkin, My Health app on the Health Report's website.
End-of-life care can be really quite tricky, and people may have heard of advanced care directives, but only 14% of older Australians actually have one in place. Whilst they can help guide end-of-life care, there can be some complexities, and often all situations aren't covered. So
it's impossible to predict. Like, are you going to accept antibiotics if you've got a sore ear?
You can't necessarily think of all of it. And this is where artificial intelligence may have a role. Who knows? Our producer, Shelby Traynor, has looked into this, the role of AI in this space. And as you alluded to earlier, Norman, there are some convincing arguments here.
I think it's really important having someone that can speak on your behalf that knows you well, that knows how you'd like to live your life and what sort of things you would or wouldn't want at the end of your life.
Nicola Champion is more familiar than most people with the end of life. She's a palliative care nurse who also took care of her dad in his final weeks in their hometown of Port Pirie.
Dad was an interesting character, very independent, very strong views on things, great sense of humour.
Nicola's dad Charlie had prostate cancer, but he'd lived a relatively healthy and independent life until 2 years after his diagnosis, when he arrived on Nicola's doorstep out of sorts.
And I opened the door and he said, "I thought you were going to look after me when I got sick." And I was really taken aback because I thought, well, yeah, I will.
It turned out he was in a lot of pain. Charlie's cancer had spread. He would have 6 weeks left if he didn't do anything, 6 months if he did.
And my dad just said, "I'll take the 6 weeks." He never once said, "Why me?" He just so pragmatic, and he was just like, "Well, that's it. That's my lot. I've got 6 weeks."
Charlie had an advanced care directive that Nicola helped him write out. An advanced care directive lets doctors know what you do or don't want at the end of life. Would you want to be given antibiotics? Would you want a blood transfusion if it could extend your time?
I don't remember so much the conversation, but what I know is that he fully trusted me. So we didn't go down to every scenario that he might want to consent to or not consent to. He just appointed me as his medical decision maker.
Surrogate decision makers are people you legally designate to make decisions for you in the event you become incapacitated. For example, if you're in a coma or aren't cognitively aware of what's going on.
So for me, it was about really knowing my dad's values in life and the way he liked to live and the way I think he wanted to die. And so that's what was going to guide my decisions.
Not everyone will have a surrogate decision maker. And even if they do, those surrogates aren't always available in an emergency. And they don't always feel equipped to make tough calls. It can be incredibly stressful to be the voice of someone who can't speak for themselves.
It happens so frequently in the ICU where patients are critically ill and can't make decisions for themselves. And you see their family and their surrogate decision makers struggling with the burden of that choice.
This is Dr. Teva Brenda, an internal medicine resident at the University of California, San Francisco. He saw this situation play out almost daily.
The patient has a breathing tube, they can't speak, or they're so ill that they're confused. And every decision becomes this huge pivot point. Do we continue antibiotics? Do we pursue this procedure or this surgery?
Only about 14% of older Australians have an advanced care directive. So life-saving or life-ending decisions can come down entirely to a family member. And there's a lot they need to know to make an informed decision. Dr. Brenda and his mentor wondered if there was a better way, a less stressful and more accurate way to come to these decisions.
And so we were just chatting together, and AI has obviously been in the news since 2020 with ChatGPT, and we thought, well, how could we leverage artificial intelligence to help surrogates? Because this is such a common problem in the ICU.
They decided to put an idea out there, drafting a paper that theorized how generative AI, or large language models like ChatGPT, might be used. Eventually, they brought in a geriatrician and palliative care doctor to get his perspective.
It's kind of funny. His first reaction to our proposal was, heck no, that's frightening, that's dystopian. Do we really want to be considering this?
But Dr. Brenda and his colleagues are far from the only people thinking about this.
My name is Brian Earp, and I'm an associate professor of biomedical ethics at the National University of Singapore.
At the same time AI was having its first of many moments in the sun, Dr. Earp was working as an editor on the Journal of Medical Ethics. In that journal, experts were trying to come up with better ways to deliver end-of-life care in line with a person's wishes. One proposal that was gaining attention was called a patient preference predictor.
The idea here is that you would do a big survey of the population, you would give people various scenarios that they might encounter, and you would ask them, what would you like to have happen if you found yourself in this situation, this situation, this situation, and so on. And then you would also collect various demographic features about people, their age and their sex and their ethnic background, their religious affiliation, maybe their socioeconomic status.
So instead of everyone filling out an advanced care directive, a sample of the population would fill one out, an extensive one. It was assumed that people with the same demographic features would make similar decisions at the end of life.
This seems to solve some of the problems, but it also was met with a lot of criticisms.
The biggest one? People don't like being reduced to their demographic features. We like to think of ourselves as unique, not just in age, sex, and ethnicity. Dr. Earp was watching the debate about this preference predictor play out at the same time he and his colleagues were playing around with AI.
My then housemate, who's also my friend and collaborator, Sebastian Potsdam-Mann, he realized there were these interfaces you could gain access to where you can further train a general model in a process called fine-tuning.
Basically, you can tweak it to fit a specific purpose. They ended up feeding their AI model dozens of their own research papers. The purpose was to teach the model to recognize the relationship between a paper's abstract, which is a short summary of the research, and the research itself.
And once it's learned that relationship, you can put in a new title and a new abstract of a paper that you haven't yet written, but that maybe you plan to write. And then you press go, and in a matter of seconds, it will just generate a draft of a paper in your voice using your style of reasoning, drawing on the kinds of arguments that you've used in the past, but applying it to this new topic.
This proved that the AI was able to learn Brian's views and apply that knowledge to new situations. So, he thought, what if it could be used to learn your views on things? For example, whether you'd want to be put on a ventilator if it gave you 6 more months of life. There was a problem though.
I work professionally in philosophical ethics, so I write dozens of papers explicitly stating what my views are on various topics. And so it's not a big surprise that this sort of model can come up with a reasonable guess about what I might say morally about some situation, including a hypothetical situation in which I were incapacitated. So we did some informal experiments with our academic paper model, and we just asked it, suppose I was in X, Y, and Z conditions, what do you think I would want to have happen, and why? And the model would typically give an answer that's at least plausible.
So if you haven't written dozens of papers on medical ethics, who has? How would an AI model learn about your preferences? Well, one way could be through social media.
There already are existing digital duplicates of us out there in the world that are owned by technology companies. So there's a digital twin of me that Amazon owns, and there's a little twin of me that Facebook owns and that Twitter owns and so forth. And they use these to predict my preferences in particular domains, namely so that they can sell me stuff. Clearly, it's possible to predict some things about people based on information you might think is not obviously or directly relevant.
Another approach would be to train AI on your medical records. Here's Dr. Brenda again.
So this morning I was in our lung transplant clinic. We have this technology. It listens to the conversation you're having with the patient. And at the end of the visit, it summarizes that in an after-visit summary that the patient can take home. And it's really, truly impressive. So what if we could record these visits and capture all of the nuance that happens in that 20 or 30-minute visit, all of the chit-chat in the door? That really speaks a lot about what's important to that person. What did they do over the weekend? How is their family, et cetera?
Some of these things really do seem like they might be far-fetched, and you might think that you'd have a much better go if you focused on specific prior treatment decisions people have made. So it's one thing to just be chit-chatting with my doctor, but if I train a model on my electronic health records, for example, which show all the various other decisions I've made, there's at least a question about the extent to which I can extrapolate from those kinds of decisions to novel cases that I won't have yet encountered.
Of course, this brings up a whole host of privacy issues. But imagine this AI could find out your vaccination status or whether you went for a more aggressive approach to cancer treatment. Dr. Earp has even suggested training the AI not passively, using data collected from the internet or from your medical records, but directly. You could take charge of building your own digital duplicate.
Whether an AI should therefore make a decision is a different question because it's an ethical question, it's not a technical question.
And this raises another problem, one that AI may or may not solve. Nicola was familiar with the healthcare system. She trusted she could make the right choices for her dad. But even with her expertise and an advanced care directive in hand, she struggled to get doctors to listen.
The way we'd worded his advanced care directive was in the terminal phase of a terminal illness, or if he was in a persistent vegetative state, that I would then speak on his behalf.
But when she tried to discharge her dad from hospital following a procedure so he could die at home, she was told he wasn't necessarily terminal because they hadn't explored all options. Options that Charlie had stated he did not want to pursue.
I just couldn't get anyone to listen to me that Dad was told he would have 6 weeks. He accepted that he was terminally ill and was going to have 6 weeks. That he wanted to be back in the country town where we were from, and I really had to fight hard to try and get him home. It's not good enough to have an advanced care plan. People have to respect it, and they have to believe that if someone's been named as a decision maker, that person didn't do that lightly.
Nicola thinks that if there had been a digital duplicate of her dad in the room that day, it might have swayed the doctors.
If they'd asked that AI, okay, what's important to you? He would have been able to say, I don't want to fuss. I want my daughter to look after me.
But as Dr. Earp points out, that all rests on AI being proven accurate and being trusted. And for that to happen, there needs to be a level of transparency around how the AI reaches the conclusions that it does.
Suppose the model says it's likely, maybe with 80% confidence, based on all the various factors that I've considered, that John would want to have treatment withheld in this situation. And some of the major evidence I'm using for this claim is that John wrote an email on January 22nd of 2015 explicitly saying to his friend Bob that if he ever was unable to feed himself, he would definitely not want to live under those conditions. Well, that would be like explicit evidence that people could then evaluate. They could say, oh, well, let's go check with Bob and confirm that that's true. And, oh, okay, so that seems like a pretty strong expression of his values. And I haven't ever heard him say anything otherwise, so maybe we should go with that. So whatever is the type of evidence that it raises is the sort of thing that can and should be then evaluated by people who know the person. You know, it might be that the person's spouse is there and asked to make the decision, and the model comes up with some reason, and the spouse says, look, that's not anything that actually reflects, the John I know. And then, okay, now you have a difficult discussion to make, and you have to do some further investigation.
I think most people recognize this isn't ready for prime time quite yet. So we're not saying that this could or should be done, but it's interesting to think about because that would be ideal, right? If there was a future where, as a physician, I could sit down with the family and say, hey, this is what this algorithm suggests. Hopefully there is some transparency there. How does that sit with you as somebody who knew and loved this person? And that can sort of be a jumping off point.
There's a long way to go in proving AI decision makers are accurate and finding out whether people would ever actually trust them to help make life or death decisions, which is why I asked Brian what he would do.
I have thought about this. I mean, a lot depends on how predictively accurate these models turn out to be once we've trained them and tested them. And so right now I sort of shrug my shoulders and say, well, it kind of depends. If it turns out that they're far more accurate on average than human surrogates, then I'd be more likely to want to have it used in cases where I lost capacity. Whether I would want to use it if a loved one lost capacity and I was the proxy decision maker, I suppose that my sense of curiosity would be great enough that I would be very interested in what the prediction was. But then I would also want to know that I could trust myself enough to not be unduly swayed by the prediction if I know that I have good reason to trust my own judgments about the person.
Nicola looks back at her time as her dad's carer and is glad she could be his voice in his final weeks. If it weren't for her, it's possible Charlie would have died in hospital rather than back at home.
I felt I knew what was important to my dad, and I feel like top of his list was me to care for him, and my understanding was for that to be in our home. He never specifically said that, but I still think about him turning up to my front door. You know, I thought you'd look after me when I was sick.
And she only felt reassured about her decision when they arrived back in Port Pirie.
He had the biggest smile on his face as we wheeled him in that back door, and it's something that I will always treasure because I just thought, I know I made the right decision.
That was Nicola Champion finishing off that story by Shelby Traynor, and earlier you heard from Dr Brian Earp and Dr Teva Brenda.
On Radio National, you with the Health Report. So in the mailbag this week, we've got some fairly strong language about my strong language.
Prostate cancer screening, there were draft guidelines that came through and we chatted it out robustly.
We did, with careful preparation.
And you did say the prostate-specific antigen, the blood test that can be used to potentially screen for prostate cancer, you said that it was a crap test.
Yep.
Joe's written in and says, I disagree with Norman's view of the PSA being crap because thanks to regular testing of my PSA over the years, Joe was diagnosed with prostate cancer and was therefore treated. Acknowledges that some false positives are surely better than some people slipping through the system. And then Andy has also written in, again to Norman, it's all for Norman this week it seems.
Punish me.
That says you need to be careful with your messaging. The PSA test is not crap. It can be useful in certain circumstances with people such as a family history or an upward trajectory of PSA results and help determine who might need a prostate MRI.
And he says, be more careful with these throwaway lines. They may be entertaining, but they may be dangerously misleading. In my defence to Joe and Andy, maybe I didn't make it clear, but I was talking about the PSA being a crap screening test.
Yes.
And that's why there is no prostate cancer screening in Australia and many other countries because of the PSA test. If there was a better test, they would do it. And it's true what Joe and Andy say, it's true. It's really good for monitoring you if you've had prostate cancer treated and watching the PSA, because if it goes up again, that's a sign that it may have come back. And if it's high and you monitor it over a period of time and it goes even higher, then that's a track to maybe intervening. And sure, it's also a sign that you might need an MRI, but it's not a great screening test in its own right. And Andy also says, and also rectal examinations are still done and are useful.
And that might be in specific scenarios, but again, for prostate cancer screening, the Red Book, the RACGP preventative health guideline that drives general practice.
So just to explain, they've got doctors and researchers together to say what's the best evidence for practice in this particular area.
That's right.
And in prostate cancer, about rectal examinations, they say?
Not recommended as a routine addition to doing the PSA in asymptomatic men. So not to use it as a screening test.
Because it can increase the PSA, can't it?
It can, but also it's just not like I haven't felt enough prostate, sorry.
Well, it's an ambition that you can actually fulfill. But the reality is, if you're a urologist, you're doing them every day of the week. But if you're in general practice, you're not doing them every week. You're not quite sure what you're feeling. I
do rectal exams to really clarify there for rectal bleeding and other things, but not for prostate cancer screening. If someone has symptoms, urinary symptoms, it might be useful. But we're talking about screening for prostate cancer, looking for people, identifying cases in men with no symptoms. In that particular instance, it doesn't have a role.
And the rectal examination is even more crap than the prostate specific antigen test.
Yes, you could say that.
I wouldn't, but I suppose I just have.
If you'd like to come for Norman in the mailbag, you can. You just have to write into healthreport@abc.net.au.
By the way, you should be subscribing to the Health Report podcast if you aren't, because otherwise you might miss an incredibly invaluable health report that could change your life or the life of your loved ones. But don't forget our sister podcast, What's That Rash, where we answer the health questions that everybody's asking. And this week, everybody's asking about the carnivore diet. See you next week.
See you next week.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.